Welcome back. This is Chris, my brother in Christ, Stephen.
Welcome back.
Date today is October 12th, year of our Savior, 2021. And the title of this video is a continuation called Stone Kingdom, Part 3. Yes, Stone Kingdom, Part 3. We're learning all about the Stone Kingdom that was set up in the time of these pagan empires mentioned and recorded in the book of Daniel and Revelation that we talked about previously. And the Rapture of the Wicked series and the Secret Rapture, exposing the secret rapture for what it really is, false doctrine. All right, so let's continue about the tracing of Israel that was removed. All 12 tribes were removed from God's sight from the Bible. That's what I mean by that. And we see that, I mentioned last video, Sharon Turner's History of the Anglo-Saxons is one of the most thoroughly documented historical studies ever produced. And its reliability is beyond question. He traces the Anglo-Saxons of Britain back to the Scythians. Unfortunately, Mr. Turner does not go the one step further, but that's okay. And trace the Scythians back to Israel. But we can do that from other credible sources. So let us go back to the Scythians. As the people of Israel became known in the land to which they were deported, Diodorus Siculus, a Greek historian who lived in the times of Julius and Augustus Caesar, says this, quote, "The Scythians anciently enjoyed but a small tract of ground, but through their valor, growing stronger and stronger by degrees, they enlarged their dominion far and near and attained at least to a vast and glorious empire. At the first, a very few of them, and those very despicable for their mean origin, seated themselves near the river Araxes. Afterwards, one of their ancient kings, who was a warlike prince and skillful in arms, gained to their country all the mountainous parts as far as to Mount Caucasus." Remember the word Caucasus, all right? Mount Caucasus, right? Sometimes afterwards, their posterity, becoming famous and eminent for valor and martial affairs, subdued many territories, then turning their arms the other way, they led their forces as far as to the river Nile in Egypt. Other historians record that blonde Scythians made an expedition against Palestine and Egypt about 626 BC. The town of Scythopolis in the Jordan Valley is named for a settlement made on this raid. But to continue with Diodorus Siculus, he says, quote, "This nation prospered more and more and had kings that were very famous, from whom the Saccans and the Massagetae and the Armaspians and many others called by other names derived their origin. Amongst others, there were two remarkable colonies that were drawn out of the conquered nations by those kings. The one they brought out of Assyria and settled in the country lying between Pamphlegonia and Pontus, and the other out of Media, which they placed near the river Tanais, and which people are called the Sarmatians. Note how Jehovah's destiny for these people were. They would not leave behind any pockets of their people in the lands where their conquerors had settled them. They it's kind of like, reminds me, don't leave no man behind, right? Go in there and take your brothers out of captivity. They had gained great power when they came back and picked up any who remained, taking them into this migrating mass. Likewise, history records that they raided Babylon after its overthrow by the Medes and Persians, and carrying off with them such of the people of Judah and Benjamin as were not going back to Jerusalem. Excuse me. Even in early times, before the final mass movement into Europe, the Scythians had begun their march to their new homelands. Some of them had already arrived before the beginning of the Christian era. Pliny the Elder, a Roman historian who lived from 23 to 79 AD, says, quote, "The name Scythian has extended in every direction, even to the Saramete and the Germans, but this ancient name is now only given to those who dwell beyond those nations and live unknown to nearly all the rest of the world. Beyond the Danube are the people of Scythia. The Persians have called them by the general name of Saka, which probably belongs only to the nearest nation of them. The more ancient writers give them the name of Aramai, or Armenians, or Aryans. The multitude of, like you have Iran too. Iran would be Aryan.
Yep.
The multitude of these Scythians is quite innumerable. In their life and their habits, they much resemble the people of Parthenia or Persia. The tribes among them that are better known are the Saka, the Massagetae, and the Dahe, etc. Now, others have noted this early migration into Germany. For example, Herodotus mentions a migration and settlement of a people he calls the Sigano, who themselves claimed to be colonists from Media and who migrated as far as the river Rhine. Remember that among the places the Israelites were resettled were the cities of the Medes. Also note that Pliny the Elder said that the more, quote, the more ancient writers give them the name of Aramaic, that is Aramean. In modern language, it is called Syrian. A Syrian ready to perish was my father, and he went down into Egypt and sojourned there with a few and became a nation great, mighty, and populous, end quote. Hence, such ancient writers could correctly identify the Israelite Scythians as Arameans or Aryans, for they had come from a land which was part of Syria. Syria. Interesting. Now, it just kind of reminds me of the first place that followers of Jesus Christ were called Christians was in Antioch, Syria. That's kind of interesting. I believe that's, I think that's Acts 11:26. I could be wrong. But among the tribes of the Scythians, the Massagetae attracted the notice of all the ancient historians by their numbers and warlike ability. Those who described them in more detail divided them into the Massagetae and the Thysagetae. The Getae part of the name soon evolved into Goth. The Getae evolved into the Goth. The Massagetae were the greater Goths, and the Thysagetae were the lesser Goths. Thus, we already find among the Scythians names we can identify as the people who later conducted the great migrations into Europe. The Goths were later known as the Ostrogoths, meaning East Goths, and the Visigoths, meaning West Goths.
Okay.
Yeah. But to go back a few centuries, the Saka were allies of the Medes and the Persians in the attack upon Babylon in 536 BC. Remember that Jehovah said, right, that Israel was my battle axe and weapons of war, for with thee will I break in pieces the nations, and with thee will I destroy kingdoms. So God had used Scythian Israel to maintain constant war against Assyria for nearly a century until Assyria was too weakened to resist the Medes and Persians. God then used the Scythian Israel, the Sake, to help in the conquest of Babylon when its time had come. Later, King Cyrus of Persia was foolish enough to try to conquer his former allies, the Saka, but he was killed in battle. King Darius also tried to conquer them, but they, being a nomadic people, retreated before his massive armies until he gave up and retired. Professor George Rawlinson says that the original development of the Indo-European language took place in Armenia, at that time, this land was occupied by Scythian Israel. Certainly from these people, we can trace the introduction of this language into Europe. You know, it reminds me of that archaeologist. He's not a Christian, but he's an archaeologist that traced about the samurais that were these Caucasians and things like that.
Oh, yeah.
But he was talking about the Scythians were the ruling class in India. And he talked about these Scythians were actually, they consumed a lot of milk, so they became more lactose tolerant, which was kind of interesting, his insight there. But I think it was Sepper. I could be wrong. Certainly from these people, we can trace the introduction of this language into Europe. This powerful, increasingly numerous people thereafter spread further north, both east and west of the Caspian Sea. To the west of it, they penetrated into the Volga and Don River valleys, Don or Dan, which is a name of the tribe of Dan, by the way, as the Sarmatians and the royal Scyths, nomadic peoples. To reach these lands, they had come up through the Caucasus Mountains by a great pass, which is today occupied by the Georgian Military Road. Well, this article is a little bit old, but perhaps the communists have changed the name of this pass in recent times. But from ancient times until within our own lifetime, this pass was known as the Pass of Israel. The Anglo-Saxon race of Europe is often called Caucasian because the ancestors of many of them did thus come out of the Caucasus Mountains. So I thought that was interesting. Have you ever filled in an application and they want to know your race and you have to put Caucasian, right? And so that's what they want to know. They want to know your specific race or people group or whatever you want to call it. Now, when Alexander the Great began his great marauding expedition across Western Asia and as far as India, he had to skirt the edge of the lands held by the Scythians. In his limitless vanity ambition, he wanted also to conquer the Scythians, but it is recorded that their ambassadors said that they would never surrender to him. They were a nomadic people who, if they could not resist, could retreat indefinitely before his armies. They had no wealthy cities for him to occupy and loot. Imagine that, right? So Alexander the Great, what did he do? Well, he invaded their lands long enough to fight one severe battle with them, defeating the Scythian forces he met.
It was Robert, it's Sepeher, S-E-P-E-H-R.
Oh, Sepeher. So it's Robert Sepeher?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and he has some really good stuff. He's an archaeologist, and he's... He really thinks outside the box, but yeah, he brought that information for it, and I thought it was more confirmation. I thought it was interesting. Evidently, this was just a lesson to the Scythians not to attack the flanks of Alexander's forces, for he led his forces out of their territory and never returned the attack. All right, remember that Israel is God's battle axe and weapons of war. They had already weakened Assyria, and as allies of the Medes and Persians have helped overthrow Babylon. They had beaten off attempts of the Persians to conquer them. And the article Scythians, Chambers Encyclopedia 1927 records that, quote, the Scythians about 128 BC overran Persia, routed several Persian armies, and levied tribute from the Persian kings. During the 1st century before the 1st century after Christ, hordes of Scythians, having overthrown the Bactrian and Indo-Greek dynasties of Afghanistan and India, there you go, invaded northern India, and there they maintained themselves with varying fortune for 5 centuries longer. The Jats of India and the Rajputs have both been assigned a Scythian ancestry. So I thought that was interesting.
It is interesting.
Madison Grant writes that ancient Bactria maintained its Nordic and Aryan aspect long after Alexander's time and did not become Mongolized and received the sinister name of Turkestan until the 7th century. The Saka were the blonde peoples who carried the Aryan language to India, end quote. So I thought that's interesting because I think Nordic could also be referring to Norse as well. All right, so a land so vast, and not the original home of the Israelite Scythians, but already having some inhabitants when they were settled there, must of course show varying types of people. The Nordic or Aryan Israelite Scythians conquered these other races, while some spoke of a Mongoloid type found in some parts of Scythia. Ancient writers pretty well agree that the dominant Saka or the Massagetae Scythians were a Nordic people. Dr. Hans Gunther, professor at Berlin University, in his Racial Elements of European History, published in 1920, states, quote, "The investigations into the traces left behind them by that widespread Nordic people, the Saka Scythians, with its many tribes, are well worthy of attention. It has been living on the steppes of southeastern Europe and spread as Turkestan and Afghanistan and even to the Indus. The ancient writers such as Polemon of Ilium, Galenos, Clement of Alexandria, and Adamantios state that the Saka were like the Celts and Germans and describes them as ruddy fair. The Scythian tribe of the Alans are also described as having a Nordic appearance. Ammianus, about 330 to 400 AD, calls them, quote, almost all tall and handsome with hair almost yellow and a fierce look, end quote. So we have seen that the names of the Massagetae and the Thisagetae involved into the Goths, the Ostrogoths, East Goths, and the Visigoths, the West Goths. The historian Ptolemy, who died about 150 AD, mentions a Scythian people descended from the Sakai by the name Saxons, who had come from Media. Albanus, who lived in the 1st century BC, also says, quote, "The Saxons were descended from the ancient Saka in Asia, and in the process of time they came to be called Saxons," end quote. Prideaux reports that the Cimbrians came from between the Black and Caspian Seas, and that with them came the Angli. That's where you get the term Anglo-Saxon, right? Angli is where you get Angli, which where you get the word English, okay, in the English language. It comes from the Anglo-Saxon, that concept there. So we are now well established, we are now well into established European history. By the beginning of the 4th century, many of the Goths were already Christians. In the 4th century, there were several collisions between Visigoths and Rome, and in 410 AD, the Visigoths became the masters of Italy and captured Rome. Later, they moved on into southern France and northern Spain, where they settled permanently. The Ostrogoths settled in what is modern Hungary about 455 AD under Theodoric the Great. They conquered Italy about 493 and set up an Ostrogoth kingdom in Italy, which was short-lived. Their descendants are the fair-skinned and blonde Italians of northern Italy. Well, that reminds me because when my wife was alive, we went to Rome. We went to Italy and Rome, and we were going up into the north to see the Dolomite Mountains, and I regret not seeing them, but one of our party got sick, and we decided to stay home, and I regret that still to this day. She should stay there, and I'm going to go see this as once in a lifetime opportunity. But the town was called can't remember. But anyway, it was the town that actually had more Italians with the, kind of the more swarthy look than the more Germanic look. And it was the only town, the more north you get, the more Scandinavian they look. But they're still Italians. They're still Italian. Right. So I was able to even verify that in my own lifetime. So we see that, but the Goths had ended the Roman Empire. Jehovah's battle axe, again, destroying the kingdoms of the Babylonian order of empires. The Angli and the Saxons moved up the Danube Valley and settled in Germany along the Baltic shores. From there, the Jutes, Angles, and Saxons colonized England after the Roman legions were withdrawn in 408 AD, after conquering the native Celts. Actually, the earliest waves of migration penetrated to the farthest edges of the European continent, partly because they could move through nearly empty lands without meeting any people strong enough to effectively resist them. Although they were pushed farther by the later waves of Israelite migrations coming behind them, hence we find the settlement of the Scandinavian peninsula pretty well completed before the arrival of the Jutes, Angles, and Saxons along the southern shores of the Baltic Sea. The tribes which settled along the shores of the Baltic were a great maritime people, as some of the Israelites had been, even when still in Palestine. God has prophesied this. The Jutes, Anglos, and Saxons came from within the Baltic Sea, but their ocean-borne raids on England were heavy and continuous. Later, by the invitation of the British, they settled along the eastern shores in East Anglia, Mercia, Northumbria, Sussex, Wessex, Essex, and Kent. All right. And then we have William the Conqueror invaded England in 1066 AD with the Normans, right? And that's where you have the Domus Day, where they opened that up and they found that the laws of England, of this covenant land, traced all the way back to the first Christian church in around 36 AD. And we're going to talk about that, where one of these great kings gave 12 hides of land to Joseph Arimathea, the secret disciple. And that's a drama of the last disciples, where the Jews put him in a boat. Anyway, there's a lot to this, a lot of exciting stuff, but I wanted to give a little foreshadowing, all right? So we see that William the Conqueror opened up this book, and the Dooms, was it the Domus Day? I think it's called the Domus Day. All right, they were actually Norse Vikings who had settled on the coast of France in the province of Normandy. Norman being the really derived from Norsemen, all right? Northmen or Nordic. So we see that the migrations of Israel, first into Scythia, expanding there, then gaining in the names of Goths, Angli, and Saxons, and under those names moving into their present European homelands, is a well-established historical fact. All right? So I thought that was really intriguing. Stephen, you have anything to add on that?
Just intrigued, fascinated.
All right. So we have the next chapter we're going to be getting into, and that is going to be talking about the covenant land. Yes, the covenant land. We're going to be talking about the covenant land. So now we have all 12 tribes of Israel being pushed all into Britain, Great Britain. So that's what we're going to be talking about, Great Britain being the covenant land. And that's why we hold to this Bible, because this Bible came out of this stone kingdom. Mm-hmm. All right, that is very, very important. All right, so let's continue. Now, northwest, remember northwest of Palestine. God promised his people that they would have an island or isle home north and west of Palestine. Isaiah 49, 1 through 3. Isaiah 49, 1 through 3. You have that, Stephen?
Mm-hmm. Listen, O isles, unto me, and hearken, ye people from afar. The Lord hath called me from the womb, from the bowels of my mother he hath made mention of my name. And he hath made my mouth like a sharp sword, in the shadow of his hand hath he hid me. And he made me a polished shaft, in his quiver hath he hid me. And he said unto me, Thou art my servant, O Israel, in whom I will be glorified.
Servant Israel. What about verse 12 of Isaiah 49?
Isaiah 49, verse 12. Behold, these shall come from afar, and lo, these from the north, and from the west, and from the land of Sinim. Sing, O heavens, and be joyful, O earth, and break forth into singing, O mountains, for the Lord hath comforted his people, and will have mercy upon his afflicted.
All right, and then we have I'm going to read Jeremiah chapter 3, verse 18. It says, in those days the house of Judah shall walk with the house of Israel. You notice the house of Judah being separate from the house of Israel. To say that the Old Testament is just Jewish is absolutely false. It's very important to understand. All right, so, and they shall come together out of the land of the north. They're going to come out of the land of north, and they're going to, to the land that I have given them, because that land there was given to Israel. That was Abraham. That was a promise to Abraham, that land, that's Jerusalem. That's where it gets, I believe, when the New Jerusalem's coming from heaven down to earth, the second coming of Jesus Christ. Where do you think New Jerusalem's going to be landing?
Probably on top of Old Jerusalem.
I would think so, right? And so you're going to have these people. You're going to have these people rejoined from the house of Judah and the house of Israel, all 12 tribes coming down to pay homage to the Messiah.
From the four corners of the earth.
Yes, absolutely. So we see here, in those days, the house of Judah shall walk with the house of Israel, and they shall come together out of the land of the north to the land that I have given for an inheritance unto your fathers. That's Jeremiah 3:18. And then we have Jeremiah 31:8. Jeremiah 31:8 says, behold, I will bring them from the north country and gather them from the coasts of the earth, and with them the blind and the lame and the woman with child. The woman with child is Israel. The woman with child, Israel. The child was Jesus Christ. And her that travaileth with child together. You know, this travailing with child, they say the secret rapture is like travailing with a child. Well, that's public. That's loud. Everyone's going to know about it. There's no secret there. A great company shall return thither. This is a great company, a nation, and Abraham was a father of a nation and a company of nations. Not just one little nation. It could never form a nation on its own, but a nation and a company of nation that was God's battle axe and weapons of war, that was implementing judgment on these pagan kings of the earth. Right? This is God's judgment working through the stone kingdom. So let's come to the living word of God in the stone kingdom. God bless you, and come to Jesus Christ. Bye.